Greetings! It is I, Tentus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on SPELLJAMMER. I've been talking about the various campaign settings of Dungeons & Dragons dating back from AD&D, and I've started with this one, Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in Space. Now, where we last left off, I had been discussing your characters in space. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because there's some more details we're going to go over. Proficiencies and skills. Now, throughout the editions, there have always been proficiencies and skills. The fact is, most of them stay the same when it comes to spacefaring. There are very few exceptions, and most of them are detailed as new skills or new uses of skills or new proficiencies that exist. If we're talking about AD&D, where it originated from, it would prefer that you use non-weapon proficiencies rather than secondary skills to define what you're using, because the more detailed the ability actually is better when it comes to using them in space. Then we talk about equipment. We've talked about it a little bit, but we really should talk about the economy in general, the way that money and equipment work within space. The fact is that most spheres are in fact cottage markets. There is very little economic travel in between the spheres. Only rare and precious materials tend to transverse the phlogiston and go in between different spheres. Normally, most trade is within a sphere. Thing about it now is there is no common currency throughout all of space. Gold usually does fine. The fact is that most times when you're going to go to a sphere and you don't have the proper money, if you have gold, you usually should be able to find some kind of exchange rate between local currencies and whatever you have. The only problem is you might have basically a percentage problem of exchange rates. Usually it's low, but it could be up as much as 5%. That tends to be what it is in Kryn space. 5% exchange rate if you're trying to change your currency over to theirs. And the thing is, it might be confusing some of the local currencies because you're not used to them. You're going to have to learn how to use them. Now, generally speaking, equipment also does tend to be more expensive in space. The fact is, it becomes harder to bring materials up for a planet. It costs you extra money that way. And there's not as many craftsmen and experts at making equipment up in space. So you might have to do things like ship equipment up from the planets. Basic equipment that you can carry around is about 10% more expensive. And any kind of large-scale equipment that you probably need a couple of people to carry around is even more expensive than that. The fact is, you as a DM can make the choice that a piece of equipment isn't up in space, isn't at the dock that you're at. There could be a couple reasons behind this. One, it's too expensive to ship up there. Or two, it might not just exist in this area of space. Whatever piece of equipment, if it's something unusual or different, people might not have something like that around here. Now, there's exceptions in weapons and equipment. They tend to be pretty much exactly the same as they would be within a groundling campaign within a planet. It's just that some of the more unusual weapons and armors, they might be not out in space. You might not be able to find them. It might be certain things that would be linked to a country or race, not going to find. But the generalized equipment, you can find it just fine, and there isn't really any kind of cost problems associated with it because everybody uses weapons and armor, so you don't really want to hike up the price on that one. Now let's talk a little bit more about spells and magic some more. I am going to go over a little bit more about the different ways that spells work in space and some of the changes. I have talked about some of the changes in magic and things like that, but which I will handle some more in upcoming episodes. But really today, what I want to handle is different spells in different spheres. The fact is, there are some general spells which seem to be permeating every sphere, every planet, but there are specific ones tailored to ones. The Bigsby spells are, of course, more the purview of Greyhawk. Something that Mordecai made would be on Toril and Realm Space. And Bigby's would be Kryn and Kryn Space, because it is the purview of Greyhawk, and the other is purview of Forgotten Realms. They have these different spells. And you might say, well, there could be different versions of them that just don't have the same names, that were created by different people. Or maybe a spelljammer, a spelljamming mage, basically learned it in the one sphere and brought it into another. So I should be able to take anything from any sphere anywhere. That seems logically correct. But this is important. You as a DM, you as a dungeon master are encouraged to throw that idea out the window. Boof! Gone. Don't even think about it. That is not the right way to think. The fact is, there are countless spells built into each of these campaign settings. All the different campaign settings which might not fit within your world. They might not fit in the planets you're going to because they are designed for those campaign settings. You see what I'm getting at here? The fact is, when you consider bringing a spell from one campaign to another campaign, look at it carefully. You're going to have to consider every place that you're going to have your players visit, that you're planning on having them visit, that you're suggesting they visit, that they can visit, and the uses of it that they're going to get and how it pertains to your character. You look at it carefully, and then you make the decision whether this spell is appropriate for your game world. You have to think about the fact that because wizards in one world are not going to learn the spells of a wizard of another world, or maybe the wizards of this world, they're keeping that spell secret. So why would these spread? Why would they be the same? It might get lucky that someone over here might effectively invent the same spell, but it's a very good chance they wouldn't. They'd come up with their own version of something similar, but just a little different. So, why should your spelljamming characters have it the same? They don't have the same use. They're not native to this place. They're not connecting with the spells of this realm like someone that's living there 24/7. They're going out in space and visiting like a day or a couple days, maybe a week at most, then they're off again. They're not going to get that connection with the spells which are intrinsic to this place. Now the book lists a number of spells, both arcane and divine, that come from various different source books of different campaign settings that are specifically for those campaign settings. It gives you information on how they act differently in space. So this is, of course, in the Spacefarer's Handbook, the book pictured here. If you want to check these out and possibly use some of these spells, this is a supplement of information about them. And these are, of course, spells from AD&D, so they might not be updated for 5th edition or editions since then to use. But you can take a look and consider them for your spelljamming games. It will let you know. And any similar spells to them you can also think about too. This will give you a chance to reference also more modern spells which might be related to it, and how it will affect those more modern spells also. That some of your spells might have extra uses in space, just because of the nature of it's a different sort of setting and environment completely. You'll have to think about that, and think about it carefully when it comes to your spell casting. So that's it for today. I introduced you to some more information about making your characters in Spelljammer. I, of course, talked about the proficiencies and skills that you're going to have, and how they're very easily adapted to space, and you don't really have to do a lot to add them in from your groundling characters in whatever campaign or edition that you're using. I then talked about equipment and economies. The fact that the economies don't travel in between spheres as much you have, money doesn't translate quite as well as you have, and things are probably more expensive in space. Except for weapons and armor. You can get those pretty good price. And then, of course, I talked a little bit more about magic in space. I discussed the fact that spells between different spheres and different planets don't translate as well. And it's more than likely that spells to specific planets, spheres, your characters probably might not know those if you're just visiting. If you're from there, that's an entirely different story. But if you're just visiting a place, you're probably not going to learn it. And if you want to, ask your DM, and you as the DM, when your players ask you, consider it carefully before you make any final decisions. In our next episode, we're going to finish up talking about your characters in space, the last few details we want to go over. And then I'm going to talk about strongholds in space, space-based strongholds. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave them in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's just for the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon. Link description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.